Thank you for all joining. Let's kick off this morning in this live session on how to support your people post-pandemic. I'm Harry Bliss, CEO and co-founder of Champion Health, and the reason why we put this on quite simply is because of the amount of requests for this. Now, the last year has thrown so many curveballs and we've been fighting so many fires that we've never had to fight previously. And quite simply, we've had to be reactive. Anyone that said we could have prepared for this or we could have been proactive is talking a load of rubbish, quite simply. And so what we now need to do is focus post-pandemic. We've done as much as we could have done as well-being leads, as HR leaders, as health and safety, and all the rest of our positions that have joined us today. But what we now can do is look forward to the future in supporting our people post-pandemic. And that may look very different to what we had in place over the last 2 years. So in terms of the live session today, what we love is for it to be collaborative at the heart of it. So please ask questions throughout using the chat. And I'll actually ask you, if you can post one thing that you want to take away from today, just in the chat, hopefully we'll get round to it in the Q&A in about 15 to 20 minutes. The key thing for me is that if you're joining this live session, I want you to take away one thing. And if you take away one thing, we've done our job. So if you can just post one thing, whether that's on how to start the conversation, for example, with Teams on a Teams chat, or even how to support the workforce going back into the workplace. Anything that would just be really useful for you, we'll be able to cover within this live session today to make it really tailored and useful for you. The session will also be recorded, and so you'll have access to the slides afterwards. Gethin is an absolute, and I'm not just saying this, a fountain of knowledge. I've learned so much from Gethin over the last few years, and there's going to be so much information that's shared with you that's going to be applicable and relatable to your organisation. So you can come back to the recording anywhere at any time going forwards as well, and they'll be sent through to you by the close of play tomorrow. And the final thing is we will be reading out some questions. So please say, if you want us to keep it anonymous, just put on anon at the end of your message if you want to keep those anonymous. Now, who this session is for is really important. Quite simply, it's for any employee, colleague, anyone that's working in HR, anyone that's a CEO, business leader in a leadership position that truly cares about their teams. That's really important for us, is that we've got people and we've got an audience really engaged that truly care about their people going forwards. So this session is really for you. And we listened to you and listened to you when you registered and you told us what mattered. Now, one of the elements that we're going to cover today is around change fatigue. And actually, there's so many things in the world in the last year, inside and outside of the workplace, that have led to change. And we know that can sometimes be something that's very tricky, especially in the larger organizations. So we're going to touch upon that, how we can communicate with our populations to make change more efficient and easier. Also looking at social anxiety. Social anxiety has been something that has really skyrocketed over the last year off the back of the data. And we're going to look at returning to the workplace. I'm slightly hesitant with the term returning to the workplace because we've all been working longer hours, and that's what the data is showing, than pre-pandemic. And so we need to be very careful of not saying returning to work, because people have put in a huge shift over the last year. But we'll talk about how we can support people with social anxiety. The third element is then around how to make sure people are okay when they're working remotely. And that will really touch upon the things that Gethin's going to talk about listening and communicating with our colleagues going forwards. And the final thing, again, is how to start conversations with teams, clients, colleagues about mental well-being. We've come so far already in the last year, I truly believe that, but there is still a long way to go. We achieved a lot in Mental Health Awareness Week, but we've got 51 other weeks in the year that we need to continue these conversations and continue the excellent work that we've seen our members doing. So if you do want to add anything to this, just add your comments into the chat within here and we'll be able to get round to them to make it hyper-personalised and relatable to you. So there are 3 topics that we're really going to specifically cover initially, and then it's going to move into a Q&A. So the first topic is listening. This is something that's often forgotten about, and it seems so obvious in the workplace. But often listening is something that our teams can improve on, and it leads to huge impacts that Gethin will be sharing as well. The second thing is around communication and verbal, non-verbal communication across the workforce, and whether that's in a remote, hybrid, or in-office workplace. And the final element is trust. And I think Gethin's going to touch upon this later on, but we've had to trust our teams over the last year, and that's been a huge thing. That it's probably been the largest social experiment over the last year, quite simply, in terms of in the workplace and working from home. And we've learned to really trust our teams, but how we do that going forwards is absolutely imperative to our organizations functioning well, but also our individuals thriving inside and outside of the workplace. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce Gethin. Gethin's a good friend of mine, but also I've learned so much from Gethin over the years. He's a influencer, an author, a podcaster within here, a director of Wellbeing, and it gives me a huge amount of pleasure to welcome Gethin to this live session today. The first topic that we're going to cover is on how to get better at listening to our people. So what I'm going to do now is pass over to Gethin. Gethin's going to talk shortly about how we can listen better to our people. And I'd love to see all of our comments in the chat, and I'll be able to go through those. So welcome, Gethin. Morning.
Excellent. Thank you very much for having me. Yeah, so listening's been a fascinating one. I think long before the pandemic, we started getting to this point where we were starting to think about how do we ask people, how do we get them involved, and how do we listen to what they've got to say. And I've been doing loads of research over the last couple of years about listening at work. And one of the most important things we can do, I think, for any employee's experience at work or their well-being is to just ask them what they need and ask them how things are going. And, it's lots of companies listening to this webinar will ask their people on a regular basis, kind of, what do you need? And, core set of questions most companies seem to send out. And when you look at some of the data from people like Reba about a year or so ago, about 70% of organizations are still only asking people on an annual basis, what do you think of work and how can we help you and what support is being offered? And if you think about, if you sent out a survey every year and you sent it out in February, what would February 2020 tell you about what was going to happen that year? So asking people at that one point would kind of make no difference at all to the way that people interacted with you, because what was about to happen in 2020 from kind of February onwards completely changed the landscape. So that information, that data became redundant really, really quickly. And so I think the pandemic showed us just how quickly those well-being priorities can change. And so I think asking the right questions at the right time is probably a really, really important thing for people to understand. And I also think acting quickly. I think there are still going to be anxieties and issues when we return to work. So as easing starts, if that continues, and the end of January in the UK is the point at which we start to kind of hopefully release all those restrictions, there will still be variants, there will still be local lockdowns, there will still be lots of kind of changes. And so although the situation might get settled in the UK by autumn, I think it's going to remain with us for some time. And I think that return to the physical workplace has to begin a really long strategy in asking people and listening to what they've got to say. And I think one of the really important parts of kind of listening to people is then how you act. I think nothing will boost engagement more than asking somebody what they need, but nothing will kill it quicker than them not acting on what they've said. And so I think it's fascinating, I think, to see in the first couple of months of the pandemic in the UK, engagement scores in 2/3 of companies went up. So 2/3 of the UK reported higher engagement scores 2 or 3 months into the pandemic. And I thought that was fascinating. But then the reason why they went up is because employers started acting the way that we always expected them to. So suddenly your CEO was getting on a video call with you saying, look, we're in this together and I care about you and the company's there for you. And if you're struggling at home, if you've got childcare, if you're a single parent, speak to us and we'll do what we can to help you. And employees were invited to kind of regular updates and felt like they were part of organizations. So even though they were working apart, we did more to make people feel like they were part of something. And I think that's really telling, because I think as the lockdowns have started to ease, engagement scores have started to go down again because we forgot that initial kind of camaraderie that we pulled people together. And I think the big risk for us going forwards is we forget everything we learned in the last 12 months and we go back to this kind of command and control, and we don't listen to people and we don't trust them and we don't communicate with them the same way we have for the last year or so.
Brilliant. That's fascinating. And I think it's really crucial that it is, as you say, not just an annual thing that you look to talk to employees. It's more regular than that. How can you balance survey fatigue, which is an issue in some organizations, with actually doing no surveys or one survey a year, for example? What's the fine balance? Is there a frequency that you found to work?
I mean, so one of the things that fascinates me about surveys is, I think with anything to do with the workplace, anything to do with employee well-being, if we can empathize more with what that experience is like for the individual, we will make that better. And we all complete surveys, right? Whether we're employees or consumers. So if I get my mobile phone provider sending me a text saying, you spoke to us earlier on today, we want to kind of ask your questions about what the service was like, how we could improve it. What is in that for me? Why is it worth my time, 5 minutes, to sit down and tell O2 how they can get better at dealing with their calls? Now, sometimes they'll incentivize that with, it would give you £100 voucher or enter you into a competition or whatever it might be. And I think if we think about that in a workplace context, I don't think we put surveys in front of people with the idea of, we want to get better. We want to create this better world for you. Tell us what's wrong and we can fix it. And so, I would love people to get to separating their surveys out so that you're asking people very specific things. So you're basically, so if you're having a mental health survey, I think, you should be saying to people, look, this is about you and us creating a better environment for you and creating the support you need. So it's really important you take 5 minutes to tell us what's wrong, and we want you to be truthful. I think, not enough surveys kind of take that attitude of, this is what's in it for you. This is why you should give us this information, because this is what we expect to change on the back of it. Lots of surveys and lots of survey questions are very selfishly worded, I think, for the organization. So kind of, why do you feel proud to work here? It's things like that, like, why do you feel proud to work for us? When we should be asking questions like, what more could we be doing for you? And do you think we care about you? So I think you can change some of that dialogue to make it more about the employee. And I think that will start to get people engaged in completing them. And exactly as you've said as well, to combat that fatigue, we've got to see that if I'm going to tell you something, that's going to get better. And again, we've all done this as consumers, right? I did it before the pandemic. I remember went for Sunday lunch at a pub with my parents. Service was terrible. When I got home, I had an email asking me to kind of rate it. I told them, and they kind of said, "Oh, come back and we'll give you a voucher." And I was like, "Well, this should have been done at the time. It makes a difference." We did go back there a couple of months later, and the service was just as bad. And so I felt even more annoyed than I did the first time, because they'd asked my opinion and then didn't improve anything. Yeah. So I think that's a really important part as well, is if we can't act on what people want, we need to explain to them why we can't do that, and we need to be honest with them. But like I say, I think asking people what they want and then ignoring them is just as bad, if not worse, than not asking them at all.
It's a similar thing. It's really fascinating, Gath. It's a similar thing with Mental Health Awareness Week, that I saw some organisations' awareness raising backfire because it didn't translate into action. Yeah. And where we're raising awareness, saying that we need to break the stigma, but there's a huge stigma in the workplace still, and people aren't allowed to talk about it, yet they're publishing it on socials, arguably, that's just going to alienate people even further within there. And that really rings true with what you're saying within that. Look, if you're asking people for feedback, they're happy to give it if it's going to be acted upon and if they feel heard and listened to. So that's huge. How important do you think? I talk to our academics regularly, and they will say that a lot of academics will have a preconceived hypothesis of what they're going to achieve off the back of the study. Do you think there's a danger with organisations sometimes saying, this is what we want to find, and so this is how we're then going to shape the questions? And how do you get rid of that, any kind of bias when creating those questions initially, and so you're truly getting a valid response from employees?
Yeah, so this stuff plays to my research degree in psychology, because it's all about kind of how we phrasing questions, because we know the way and the frequency at which questions are asked can have a big impact on how people answer them. I think what I find fascinating is, I've written about this before, and one of the great examples that I think people can really kind of think about the questions they ask is, and this is a bit random, but there's a Channel 4 program in the UK called Four in a Bed, and it's where B&B and small hotel owners will stay in each other's premises overnight for the course of a week, and then they will rate their stay. And so they get given a survey at the end of each stay, and that is, what were the hosts like? What was the breakfast like? What were the facilities like? Was the room clean? All that kind of stuff. But the onus is always on the very last question, which is, would you stay here again? And so on the balance of your experience, you might have thought breakfast was great, but it could have been cleaner. The bed was a bit too warm. The pillows were lumpy. But on the balance of everything, you really enjoyed the stay, so you would come back. And although the previous questions will help you refine that experience better, ultimately, if somebody's willing to come back, on the balance of everything, you've done enough to make that experience great. And I think we need to start thinking in that way when we design surveys at work, because we need to be asking people that, we might not be able to pay you what you want to get paid, but we're going to give you this instead. You're going to get this level of autonomy. You're going to get remote working opportunities, all this kind of stuff. And I think, I've seen surveys with many customers over the years who will ask questions like, how satisfied are you with your pay compared to your peers?
Yeah.
That's a question people have asked.
Yeah.
And that goes straight to the fact that people will always compare themselves favorably to other people. So if you ask everyone in the UK what their IQ score is, most people will say they're above average.
Yeah.
So people will always favor themselves. So any comparison questions, you will never get a true result straight away. But again, like if you ask people, is your pay fair? Most people aren't going to say yes, because they think they might be doing themselves out of a pay rise by saying, I'm quite happy with what I've got. And when I worked at Legal & General, we used to always survey staff, and we used to always score really low on one question, and that was, are you proud to work here? And we never knew why we scored low on it. And I remember we sat in a manager's meeting, and I was about 23, 24 at the time, and we were trying to argue over kind of, why is this question low? Why aren't people proud to work here? And then somebody kind of said, what does the question even mean? Like, are they proud as in they wouldn't be embarrassed to say they work for Legal & General? Like if they met somebody in a bar and they said, where would you work? You'd be ashamed to say that name. Or am I proud because they do a lot of charity work and I have opportunities to volunteer within the local community? Kind of, what does that mean? I think, again, we don't empathize with the individual. We don't look at that question and kind of subjectively, how would I interpret that? And would my upbringing and my education and the language I speak, would that kind of make me interpret that question in a different way? So I think we've got to get better at kind of how we ask those questions. And exactly as you said, why are we asking those questions? Because again, I've seen people say, you're happy with your pay. Loads of people say no. And then the company says, well, we benchmark it and we think it's pay. We think it's fair pay. And so I'm looking at that going, well, so why ask the question? Asking the question if you're just not going to listen to the answer, or you've already got an answer, or you're not going to improve something. And so I think we just need to get a lot better at kind of thinking exactly as you said about kind of why are we asking this question, and not necessarily what do we want to get out of it, but why do we want to know the truth, and why is the truth important to us?
Brilliant. I've taken away 4 things within there, Gethin. I was scribbling down as well. So I'm learning a lot just even within here. So around frequent surveys, making sure that it's not annual. Having the why behind the questions is really important. So not just creating the questions for questions' sake, and that's all unique to your organization. Looking at the benefits for the individual as well within there, that look, we can then act upon it, and this is going to benefit you by X, Y, and Z. And then also listening and acting, following it, probably the most important one that can lead to disengagement if we don't do that. So I think that there's loads of takeaways for our audience within there and for our members. So moving on, I love this graphic. We're umming and ahhing whether to have David Brent as well within there. So that'll be on the next one, I promise. But around communication, it's hard now. It's harder to communicate with our teams. There's not the sort of informal digital water cooler chat that you'd have before. You're not catching up in a sort of informal way and discussing non-work related matters as much. How can we communicate better inside and outside of the organization going forwards?
Yeah, so it's true. It's absolutely got more difficult, right? You've now got people working kind of different shift patterns at different times and different locations, and that's not going to return. That's going to become the norm now, that you'll have a disparate workforce for many people, and many employers have already managed that. So many employers have kind of have engineers and salespeople and people on the road and working out different locations, and so many listeners have experienced that kind of communicating across locations and to different types of people.
Yeah.
I think what really happened during the pandemic, which is one of the really great lessons I think I wouldn't like us to stop doing, is that we almost broke down these barriers between kind of us and them, the employer and the employee. And as I mentioned at the start, everyone started to feel a little bit more like they were part of something and they worked for people who cared for them. And that came out in the tone that kind of I saw. I work with some really big companies around the world, and the tone completely adjusted overnight, which was kind of this, we always talk in Britain about this kind of wartime, everyone coming together. That's what people do, right? There's nothing that brings people together than a kind of common enemy, whether that's a pandemic or something else. And I think that the tone adjustment that we saw in communications, where people started to think about, people are dealing with a lot at the moment. I don't want this to come through as contrived, or I don't want this to kind of not be taken in the way it was intended. And so I saw lots of emails fly around where people were just rewording stuff and rewording it again and really thinking about, is this a really supportive tone for me to be using? Exactly as you said, I don't want to fall into that trap of my employees don't think I'm an inclusive environment, but I celebrate pride on Twitter.
Yeah.
So that's, you don't want to be called out for that. So you kind of want to make sure that the way you speak and the way you act is aligned. And I think we also allowed our people, and especially our senior people, to become more human. So we saw CEOs talking with empathy. We saw mainstream news. We've seen it on Twitter and social media, where CEOs were sharing their home lives. Loads of great videos going around of people being interviewed on news channels with, just in a suit and just a pair of boxer shorts rather than trousers, or in. And I think that we let ourselves into each other's homes, kind of metaphorically, and I feel like the tone adjustment we saw was a really, really good part of developing a better employee experience. That kind of the candor and honesty that we saw from our senior leaders, I think that really allowed more people to speak their own truth, and to get on a webinar and wear a hoodie, which I would never have done at the start of the pandemic, but I kind of purposefully wore it today to show that, this is what, I'm in my home. This is where I live.
Yeah.
Why can't I be comfortable? And I think that's been a significant shift. My experience of working with the workplace, I think that's been a significant shift in the way we speak to people. And I think communications has now turned to this point where it's become less about me just giving you information or telling you to do something. So communication at work, internal communications, has always been about, we're telling you something, or you have to go and do something. And it's now just became a kind of the fabric of the employee experience, really. We've started to realize that actually there are very close links between well-being and communications, because the way we communicate people will affect their well-being. And the great example, I think, is, imagine if your CEO, or you are the CEO, but imagine if you worked somewhere and your CEO sent you a message on Friday night saying, "Hi, Harry, just need to have a chat with you on Monday. Have a great weekend." That would fill you full of anxiety. And I think we're now in this world where people now will take a pause and say, "Oh, that's not a very good email to send." Even if it's just a casual meeting I wanted, that will drive anxiety. And someone who's coming to work for you, someone's applied for a job, they thought they had a good interview, and you leave it 3 weeks before you get back to them. That's not empathetic. That's a really anxious period of time, applying for a job and waiting to see if you've got it. So how can we design that experience better around well-being, to say, actually, we know people are going to be really anxious, so why don't we have a standard process where we send them an email and let them know what the time frame is going to be, so they don't just spend the next 3 weeks thinking they didn't get the job, or hanging on for a job that maybe they didn't get. And so I think the last 12 months has taught us the importance of language and that communication, and communicating frequently with people as well, because employees have become a source of truth. I think that's what most people forget as well. During the pandemic, HR, reward and payroll and benefit teams were waiting up and watching Boris Johnson do an announcement on Sunday night. And then on the Monday morning, they were translating that into a group-wide communication. And so they became the source of truth. And so for a long time, the employer has become the most trusted institution in the lives of people in 53 countries or so. And I think that's become even more exacerbated by the pandemic, where we now want to go to our employer for the truth. And so that communication has become really, really important.
And it'll lead on to trust shortly as well, within there. And I think I found that there's more empathic leadership. I found as a leader myself that I think I've become more empathic within there. And do you think that certain leaders have experienced anxiety potentially for the first time, and so that's led to them being in the same boat as, or being able to empathize better with the whole of the workforce? What's been the main change? You mentioned the sort of wartime mentality within there. But why have leaders suddenly started, or certain leaders started really pushing the agenda on this?
So I think that there's been a lot of evidence for quite a long time that vulnerability at work, and I've always seen that as a strong leadership trait. I will always gravitate to people who are vulnerable. I think the more we understand each other's lives and challenges, the better colleagues and friends we can be. And I think we've started to understand that a little bit more. I don't have kids, and so I've got nephews to spend time with. I know lots of people who've got kids, but I don't have that experience in my life. And I've started to realize now just how difficult it must be for people to be managing, working from home, and then kind of having to, I've had meetings with people who've had to turn around every 5 minutes to deal with their kid. and it's such a like ridiculously stressful environment for a kind of a single
Sure.
parent, even kind of a two-parent family, to deal with that. And so I think having exposure to that during work time has made me think about other people's priorities and other people's challenges a little bit better. So I think I have hopefully become a better colleague because I've
Yeah.
been able to be more conscious of, actually, well, if you need to see the kids, let's meet at 2 o'clock, or if it's too difficult today, let's meet tomorrow. So we've just given each other a bit more breathing space, and we've given each other a bit more time. And even at Benefex, I've had virtual coffees with junior members of staff that I've never met before. We've onboarded a lot of people during the pandemic, and I've never done that before, but I've become really conscious of, seeing somebody tweet something who works at Benefex and say, is this person struggling? I'm not the line manager, but do they need to speak to somebody? And if they can't speak to their line manager, could I be somebody else they could speak to? And so I've done more of that. So I think leaders have just become, maybe we've kind of forced a little bit of empathy on people. And certainly the whole pandemic has opened society's eyes to the growing inequalities we've had in society.
Yeah.
Anyway. So I've been amazed to see things like, something like 1 in 4 people in the UK do not have access to an outside space or shared garden. And so, I live in an apartment that doesn't have a balcony or an outside space. So I've been in that group. We've got shared gardens though. And so my experience of being at home is difficult than others because I can't go out and get that fresh air. But then you look at the data and it shows you that if you're a black person living in the UK, only 1 in 8 people have access to an outside space or shared garden. So all of a sudden you start to see that those inequalities are widened in ways we didn't expect to see. So the pandemic has been a bigger challenge for people because of who they're married to, or the colour of their skin, or their gender, or the fact that they've got kids or not. All these factors have started to make us realise that life is challenging for people in a number of different ways, and we've become better at understanding that. And again, I think the more we understand those challenges, the better we can deliver well-being schemes, because we can start to think about gender, race, and sexual preference kind of related well-being issues, and tailor those a little bit more to get things like gender specific strategies around well-being and that kind of thing.
It's really interesting you mentioned that. So I was speaking to a member recently, and a client of Champions, and they were struggling to see trends in the data around whether there are gender trends with anxiety, for example. And the biggest trend was actually where they lived, the postcode that they resided in. And that's something we often ignore within these kinds of surveys and within the questionnaires as well. So it is really delving into the depths of that. Just to summarize again, there's some really gold content that you've got across there around being more human, and vulnerability. I think vulnerability is a huge thing for me as well. Just from a personal angle, I had some really bad news from my dad, that he had a brain tumor around half a year ago. I opened up to the team, and I may not have done in other times. I broke down, and just that next week, I had so many people coming to me and talking to me about opening up about their struggles that I wasn't aware of. And that was just a prime example of a leader in a certain position actually showing vulnerability, and showing human characteristics. And that only led to the organization being more human and being closer together. And I think that's a really important thing for leaders, to show those vulnerabilities and not to bottle things up. That was a huge learning from me, just from that real life example within there.
Yeah, I think my own experience is what led me to write the book in kind of 2017 was I was really struggling with work for the first time ever. I developed a lot of imposter syndrome, a lot of anxiety around work. And I was in a meeting with a pitch with one of our sales directors. We did a really good pitch. We ended up winning the customer, so it was a good pitch. And they left us in the room for 15 minutes afterwards and said, look, we've got the room booked. If you just want to hang around and catch up on your emails, you can do that. And we did that. And he turned to me and said, that was good. So how's everything going for you? How's work? And I started crying in front of him. And he was kind of like, oh shit, is it that bad? And I was like, it's not that bad. It's just nobody's asked me yet kind of how it's going whilst all this has been building up. That prompted me to have a phone call with the HR director, which I then spoke. I then cried on the phone to her, and then I had a chat with our EAP provider, and I cried on the phone to them. And it was probably about 12 months later before I then did anything with it. But that led me to do some executive coaching and then ultimately counselling to get over something that happened at work, 10 years ago. And so that was a pivotal moment in my career, was crying in front of somebody in work. As a 6'4", now 40-year-old man, 18 stone, crying. I never expected to be that type of person, but I'm glad I did it, because I think
Yeah.
and I think you're talking about this now in front of people gives permission to anyone else to say, you can still be very good at your job, you can still be very well paid, you can still be very successful and cry at work.
Yeah.
We should all be doing it more. And I am incredibly lucky that, I'm celebrating 10 years this year with a company where almost every member of staff in a senior position has been very vulnerable in front of their people. And it makes for an amazing culture.
It does, and it's not just anecdotal statements. And thank you for sharing that, Gethin, first of all. But the researchers behind it, Google published a study. We had a session on psychological safety a couple of weeks ago with Jamie Broadley that you can go back and watch over. And Google published a study that was the one common trait of high-performing teams was psychological safety within here. And I suppose that takes on perfectly to trust and looking at trust within our organizations. In terms of trust, we've had to, certain organizations that may not have trusted people to work from home, we've had to learn to across the last year. Do you think that could change at all going into the future? Do you think that will be sustained? And how can organizations sustain the levels of trust going forwards?
So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. So we absolutely trusted people more. What's interesting is what a great experiment that was, but that was thrust upon a lot of organizations. That wasn't a choice they made to trust people. And so I think there's a clear difference between people wanted to, and I just had to trust people because they were out of sight. So I think workplaces became a little bit kind of less command and control, and managers started to realize that actually maybe I can trust people to get on with it. And I think historically we've always designed for bad apples at work. So one of the reasons why, I've been talking about flexible working at conferences for a decade or so. And people used to always say, sounds great, would never work in my company because Dave would abuse it and I know what he's like. And so I'm always kind of then saying, well, that's not an issue with the policy, that's an issue with your individual. And if you don't trust them, why are they working for you in the first place?
Yeah.
It's a hiring decision, that's not a working decision.
Yeah.
And I think the same thing now is, we had to show managers that you could trust people. And I think we would have got to this place over time anyway. But actually what we started to realize is that by thrusting upon them, that we kind of succeeded, hopefully, in that experiment. And I've actually written an article on trust for HR Zone, which is coming out next week. So I've got some stats written down here, which I thought were quite interesting. So as of 2019, research showed that only 1 in 3 managers say they trusted their team. So only 1 in 3 in late 2019. And when the pandemic started, many employers cringed at the thought of having to trust their people and just let them work out of sight. But as the pandemic went on, more than half of employees say they felt their colleagues were more productive than usual, and 90% of companies say they believe their culture improved during COVID-19. And so I think that pandemic forced people to trust, and then we started to see some of those results from a business perspective start to kind of emerge. And I think part of the key to getting us to trust more people is to play back, we trusted them, and look at the result for happening. I think we need that 360, especially with managers. Managers need to show, if you trust your people, these are the results you'll see. And in 2020, those organizations who trusted their employees said that their employees showed 74% less stress, 50% higher productivity, 13% fewer sick days, 76% higher engagement, and 40% less burnout. So really, really strong results, even in the middle of a pandemic. So I can only imagine these would probably be better outside of a pandemic. And so the big challenge, I think, with trust is it is up to us as employees to give it first. Employees do not earn our trust. We give them trust and we let them abuse it effectively. And when you look at all the data casually in society about whether you can trust people or not, huge experiments in psychology where they've dropped wallets at train stations in 70 countries around the world and monitored to see what people did, put trackers in them to see if people handed them into police stations, filled them full of money to see if people took the money out before they handed the wallet in first. And in almost every country, more people than they expected handed the wallet in, and the more money that was in the wallet, the more likely it was to be handed in, not handed back or stolen. So on the whole, whenever you look at experiments around honesty boxes and people just like leaving money in a cash machine or dropping wallets, on the whole, in almost every country in the world, you can trust most people. And so I think, why do we not trust people? Because that negative experience we've had at the time we trusted somebody and they abused it sticks in our head and is about 5 times stronger than the time we trusted somebody to get on with the job. And so I think we just need to push past that and make sure we don't go back to 2019 of not trusting people. That blanket trust, I think, needs to be given out to everybody.
I think that's so important that I hear some organisations say that, yeah, trust is earned, and it needs to be the flip of that. I completely agree with you there, Gethin. And in terms of good and bad practices across our organisations, across the organisations that we see, are there any examples of, firstly, bad practices to not follow? I saw the CEO of WeWork talking about the most engaged organisations are those that are wanting to go back to the office, and of course he's just wanting to sell office space. But are there any other bad practices and bad examples, and on the flip side, good examples of organisations that are really preparing for the long-term future in a proactive way?
Oh, I mean, bad practices, kind of, take your pick. I think for you could go into Google and put in, PricewaterhouseCoopers, KPMG, Goldman Sachs. Lots of companies have dropped the ball in one way or another over the years, and so you can kind of see how people are reacting to kind of overwork, forced working conditions, kind of CEOs or senior managers saying something that they probably shouldn't have. And so I think, there are some really bad examples, but there are also loads of great examples. And I think what we now have is this really nice situation where the court of public opinion on employers is open all the time. And so every time somebody does something bad, if people like Uber slip up, or Wells Fargo or Sports Direct, those companies will be in the press the following day. Everyone probably saw a note that went viral from a cleaner who resigned from her job and basically said, I might be the cleaner, but you don't speak to me the way you did. And the Sun shared that resignation letter on social media, and it got 500,000 likes and shares. And so all of a sudden, that employer was shamed in front of 500,000 people, quite rightly, because of the practice that they had in place. So I think we will see more of that. I think our expectations of what an organization is and what an employer is and how it should function has changed. So I think gone are the days where Peter Drucker called, businesses exist for profit in the 70s. Businesses now exist for a higher purpose. Businesses have to exist for sustainability and for community. And so people's measure of kind of what an organization is and what it should be there for, and that's tied up heavily in well-being, because it's how does it treat its people, is more and more significant. But I think for me, the one that really stands out was only a few weeks ago, Basecamp in the US. They put a blanket policy on their employees to say something like, we don't want you talking about kind of politics and societal issues at work. And so that's one of the things they said is, you can't talk about that stuff at work. And loads of people didn't like that. People felt like, if their religion or political views were part of who they were, and bringing themselves to work means you shouldn't be able to ban that kind of talk. People should be able to talk about whatever they like. And so the reaction was so strong that the co-founders said, do you know what? If you don't like it, you can leave. And if you want to leave, we'll give you a generous severance package. So if you want to leave, just come forwards and we'll let you leave. And people like Spotify have done that kind of thing before. This is our mission. This is where we're heading. If you're not on board, we'll make it easy for you to leave. And not many people did it. In Basecamp's example, according to one tweet I saw a couple of days ago, currently 47% of their staff have taken up that offer. So half their company has basically said, you know what, we don't want to work here. We'll take the severance package. Which is absolutely crazy that they called their bluff. But anyone who's in recruitment at the moment will tell you it's very difficult to recruit. Alan Sugar was saying recently he can't recruit the right people. So if you're not looking after your staff, they're sure as hell going to go somewhere where they will be looked after.
And being an employer of choice is one of the most important things for that. And people are looking beyond salary now. And that's what the research is showing within there. And certainly from my angle for Champion, we've got a unique culture, a unique proposition, a unique team that are all thriving, and well-being really is at the foundation of that. But really recruiting to fit into that culture, it's the hardest thing that I've found in running the business, quite simply. And it's one of the biggest challenges. And we've got to do everything we can do to be able to attract that special talent, to be able to join the company. So that really rings true. So now we're going to move on to a quick fire Q&A. So we've got some really good questions within here. Emily has asked, how do you suggest we handle the conversation with teams where some want to return to the office and some want to stay home?
So we've got that in our company. Benefex surveyed all of its staff and we kind of asked them what they wanted to do. And no surprise, most people want to work hybrid, but there's a group of people that want to stay home and a group of people that want to stay permanently in the workplace. We were kind of lucky in a lot of people had already worked remotely for at least some of the time, for quite a long time. But I think it's about, as somebody that's worked remotely for 12 years, I can tell you that one of the biggest challenges for me is feeling connected to the organization. And so when the pandemic hit, for me, it became a great leveler, because the casual meetings where somebody would be walking past an office and saying, should we talk about that thing? Have you got 5 minutes? And 3 people would go into a meeting room. I would never be there for those meetings. Now everything's done by Zoom. I'm there for each one of those meetings. So we are now working on a situation where we will allow people to kind of combine those two if they want. We had developers working in New Zealand and Poland anyway, so lots of the team stand-ups in the morning might have been 15 people in the Southampton office and then a couple of people dialing in virtually. And so I think we've really just got to, be patient with people to find what works for them. We haven't had normal home working conditions over the last 12 months. We've had home working in a pandemic, very, very different things. And so I think as people settle back into normal life and they start to realize that actually I can take my kids to school on a Monday, so that's really good for me to be able to do that and spend extra time with them and then start at work. Home working is better for me on a Monday and a Thursday for those reasons. I think as people start to realize what rhythm works for them, you'll start to see people settle into a working pattern that works for them. And so I think it's really important that you let teams manage that amongst themselves. That they can make sure the right people are in the right location at the right times and are available. And so I think, trust and empower people at that team level to make the decisions they need to make that team successful. I think blanket approaches from the top down just don't work.
Yeah, and I think there's a phrase that we use in terms of our internal values of freedom with accountability. We need to perform to provide an excellent level of service to our member base, but we need to give people the freedom because they know the best ways to work for them, and who am I to give them a specific rigid time structure. And so I think that's the key thing, is still to have the layer of accountability within there, that we do need to perform within our roles, but we need to give you the freedom to be able to do that. There's also another question from Manon around how do we balance efficiency, which is extremely high at the moment, but some staff are under strain and some aren't. So how can you get that balance of I suppose, not putting the pressure on too much? Because there's a certain amount of pressure which is healthy for some people, but that's all individual, isn't it?
Exactly. So I think one of the biggest learnings for me as a 23-year-old manager looking after 20 odd people in a team was that people's stress levels are very different, and the amount of work that people are capable of doing differs from one person to the next. And we shouldn't be shaming people for that. We just have different abilities, right? Some people can run 100 meters in 15 seconds. I can probably run it in about 45. And so I think those different abilities we need to just be accountable of and just kind of be conscious of those things. But I also think, we've had, again, an unusual year in the fact that people have been worried about job security. So people have been putting in more effort than they probably usually would because they don't want to lose their jobs. If you have to make people redundant, they don't want to be in the next cut. And also for people who've never worked at home before, you always have a period of time where you feel like everyone else thinks you're doing nothing. And so you overcompensate for that. And again, that's not sustainable. So running into its second year of home working, that will start to drop off. So we will see a drop in that performance, I imagine, because people will start to get used to working life and they'll, again, start to find that rhythm. And so I don't think we can expect people to continually work at the pace they've probably worked at for 12 months. And also, this is why we want engagement, right? You want high engagement because when the going gets tough, you want your people to put in extra effort. Yeah. And you want to see that I want to help my company because I want to see my company do well. So as the pandemic eases and we move out of the pandemic, then, that's the point where we've kind of got to give people a bit more breathing space. And if you look at what the NHS is doing, they're really worried about how do we give people time to find themselves again? And how do we give people time to relax and breathe? Yeah. Because we know it's not sustainable to keep anyone working the way that they've been working. Even people who've continued to work throughout the pandemic at their workplace, extra restrictions, masks and stuff, and social distancing, all their jobs have been made harder. So people have been trying to push through those barriers to achieve the same productivity that they always have. And so I think we've just got to give people a little bit of time and breathing space to, again, find that rhythm and not have those really high expectations that what they've achieved in the last 12 months is going to continue for the next 12 months.
Completely agree. And I think constant productivity, where productivity is at its peak for a whole year, is a myth. It doesn't happen. It goes in peaks and troughs. And that's very important. If we're to look at an athlete, and if we're to look at Jack Green, who's our new head of performance and double Olympian, I'll talk to Jack about performance, and he needs to recover. And recovery is one of the most important things for any athlete to be able to then perform at their peak. And it's exactly the same for our teams and our colleagues. And I think with the NHS, there's been a drip effect for a long time. And it's almost like a waterfall effect over the last year. And that's not sustainable, but it's very similar also within our workforces at the moment. And recovery is a really important thing, and enabling our teams to recover within there as well. So, but thank you for that question. Anne-Marie's got an absolutely excellent suggestion of what do you think of arranging listening sessions to speak to employees rather than always having surveys? I think that's great. What are your thoughts, Gav?
Yeah, definitely. Anyone who's done any kind of group therapy knows that, there's a wall that needs to be pushed through to get people opening up. But again, in almost every circumstance of human life, when you start to see other people open up over time, most people will open up. And it reminds me of being in school. When you sat at school and you've got a burning question, but you don't want to seem like an idiot, so you don't ask it. And then somebody else asks it, and the room takes a sigh of relief. And I'm glad you asked that. We see the same thing all the time with employee surveys, with live events where we allow people to submit anonymous questions to the board or the CEO of Benefex. We can see that all the time where one person asks a question and everyone will be like, I'm glad you asked it.
Yeah.
So even if those groups, we've done stuff before where those listening groups have kind of gone off on their own, produced content or questions or issues, and then given us those issues. So we don't know who raised what point in that meeting room, but we just wanted the truth, right? Because without the truth, we can't change anything. And so I think anything that helps you get people to be completely honest and truthful with you is a good thing. The challenge with it is, do you have the kind of culture where people feel like they're not going to be reprimanded for giving you the truth? And that's the big challenge with trust. And I think, I know it's come up in some of the questions, trust is nothing if I don't trust my manager. And so sometimes you need to work around that, and things like listening groups might be a good example of being able to do that.
Brilliant. And there's a question from Justine on relating to, is it really important for the line manager to be able to sort of represent the overall culture and what you're trying to achieve from the survey? So that was a question from earlier on. How important are line managers when it comes to the relationships between employees?
Really important. I've spoken a lot about this over the years, where I feel like, and I've been one of these managers, that I was given the manager's job because of tenure or technical ability. Throughout an interview process, I don't remember anyone ever asking me whether I was able to lead or encourage or motivate people, whether I had the right empathetic skills to be able to deal with issues should they arise. As a 23-year-old man, I was given responsibility over 20 people, and I realized for me to do my job properly, to manage one-to-ones effectively, to give people the time that they needed to kind of coach and encourage them, I was spending more than a week, full working week of each month, just doing personnel type stuff, where I was having those one-to-ones and asking people how they were, and almost acting like a maitre d' to the organization to make sure they had everything they needed to be able to perform. And I think, we are still not out of that way of attracting managers. There are managers that I know who are friends who've been given responsibility over managing people over the last year, and they've come to me and said, look, what do I do? And it blows my mind that we just give somebody responsibility over managing the careers of 20 people effectively without giving them any kind of training or encouragement, or even including kind of emotional intelligence or empathy skills. We don't necessarily recruit for that yet. So I think that's changing, but we're turning a juggernaut around, and for many organizations, it'll be a while before you can kind of get those managers out or into your business. But for most employees, their experience at work will be their manager. If you work in a retail outlet, for example, it doesn't matter what your head office does or what communications, your experience every day is going to be the people you work with in that store and the manager that manages you in that store. And so I think managers need to understand, and employers need to make sure, that well-being and the welfare of their team is part of a manager's job, so that a manager sees and understands what is well-being, and they understand why it's important to the organization. And you share with them all the stats, some of the things I've shared around, this is why you need good well-being in your team, because your team will perform better. And so getting team managers to embrace that and understand that. And I've seen many managers be taken from this place of command and control, and I've got to keep an eye on everyone, to actually, I completely get it now. I need to understand the way people are going. And there's somebody I know on this call who managed somebody who was challenged with their mental health, and the company wanted to get rid of this person because they were underperforming. And then this person kind of said, look, maybe if we just give them what they need and invest in them, maybe that's a better outcome. And they did that, and that person ended up staying at their business for many years later, and became a senior manager, I think. So investing in people and getting managers to see that as part of their job. Well-being and welfare of people is part of your job as a manager, and the reasons why that links to overall business goals, I think, is really, really important place. And I think that goes some way to skipping past the fact that somebody might not have the empathy or emotional intelligence that we ideally would like them to have.